Let's bring in political analyst Daniel Silke to weigh in now as voting day unfolds. Mr. Silke, good afternoon. Thank you for talking to me. So we're watching and we're sort of trying to make sense of what the turnout levels are in the various localities. It's difficult, of course, because we're talking about some 4,500 wards. But I imagine that the political parties are watching just as closely. What can you say about the ideal turnout levels and support levels that would be ideal for the major political parties, your ANCs, your DAs, your EFF and the IFPs?
Thanks very much for having me on. I think there's some critical thresholds for the major parties, and if they do not attain these thresholds, there will be pressure not only on the broader party in advance of 2024, but there'll also be pressure on the leadership and leader of those parties. And by that, I mean that the ANC desperately needs to claw its way above 50% of the national vote once all the results are in. If it gets below 50%, it becomes a vulnerable party for 2024. For the DA, they desperately need a result in excess of 20%. Otherwise, their downward trajectory from the last election will put the party into another negative situation. And it could threaten, indeed, the future of the DA leader, John Steenhuisen. So these are critical thresholds that are needed. And the percentage poll, the voter turnout, in the end, could very well determine whether these thresholds are reached. I suspect there will be different percentage polls in different parts of the country. There'll be lackluster polls in some areas. There will be more motivated voters in other areas. And I think we're going to have results that are the most unpredictable of any election in South Africa since '94.
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting you raise the consequences within political parties, the political consequences of not reaching those thresholds. I saw one of the weekend newspapers, one of the Sunday papers. I can't remember right now which one of them it was, and my apologies to our colleagues, no disrespect intended. But it was already talking about the likely fallout should the DA continue on its downward trajectory from the previous elections, and talking about possibilities of John Steenhuisen even possibly being challenged for that leadership role. And he was quoted as saying that, well, they'll have to wait for the Congress. But I was saying the DA is one of those parties where they don't play around. You don't deliver, you are in real trouble.
Well, this is, the real loser here may not be the DA. The real loser may well be the ANC, particularly if some of your polls are to come to fruition. So I think that we're going to have to wait, obviously, until the results. You can't, pontificate on all of these things for many hours. I do think, though, that a low voter turnout will signal some trouble for the parties in power, for the incumbent parties. Mm-hmm. And voters that actually go to the polls are the ones that are really motivated. Those are the ones that are either angry, want to vote for newer political parties or personalities, want to show their distress with a sitting councillor or sitting political party. It's the angry voters who are going to go out to vote. The complacent ones, the ones that just don't feel as though they're going to participate for all various reasons, they're not going to vote. So anger could very well be the determining results factor here in this election.
Daniel, just lastly then, let me ask you a bit of a tricky question. What happens next? What happens after voting is done and dusted? I know it's a bit of a difficult question. I do suspect that we'll spend quite a number of days crunching the numbers and doing the various equations, seat allocations, the permutations of who's going to talk to whom, about what coalitions, but also the political fallout. What's your sense of what happens next?
Well, you put it rather nicely, who's going to talk to whom. I always say who's going to get into bed with whom, and not such a nice concept, I might add, but I think that that's going to be the key issue, because coalitions will be necessary in many of the larger and smaller metros, and I think that who chooses which partner to get into bed with could very well determine changes in South African politics for some time to come and set the scene for a very difficult South African election, national election in 2024. So the nature of the coalitions themselves are going to, I think, be critical. The vote is one thing. If South Africans vote for coalitions, which they are likely to do certainly in large parts of the country, then I think we're in for a much more interesting, maturing political process that very well could take power away from the big hegemonic party of liberation and spread it much more, I think, interestingly and significantly across South Africa to other parties.
All right, Daniel Silke, thank you for your insights and thank you for flagging that those magic numbers, the particular thresholds for the big political parties there. You heard from Daniel Silke that basically for the ANC, nothing below 50% will do in terms of what they attain from this election. Remember, in 2016, they were at 53.91%. And that's a long time ago in 2016. The DA was at 26.9% at the end of those elections in 2016. Well, they need to be above 20% from what Daniel Silke was saying, and they'll need to do better than they did at the elections in 2019. But that was a different election altogether, a general election. Let me